We are live.
All right. Greetings, everyone. Great to see you. We're so glad to have such a full group and to see some familiar and some new faces. I'm Amy Antonucci, and I am a New Hampshire Peace Action board member, here to welcome you to our Peace and Justice Conversation series online for September 9th, 2024. Tonight, we're really excited to bring you an introduction to U.S. Chinese relations with Joseph Gerson. For over 40 years, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We always like to start with a land acknowledgement and note that we are doing our work on Nidakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. We honor with gratitude the land and the waterways and those people who have been in relationship for so many generations. Quick reminder of our Zoom guidelines. We love it when you keep your video on. We will have your audio muted to start with. You can use the chat throughout to get your questions recorded, which I'll be relaying to Joseph after he does a presentation, and later we'll also have hand raising as an option. So tonight we are really excited to welcome Joseph Gerson. Joseph is the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, the co-chair of the Committee for a Sane U.S. China Policy, and the co-convener of the International Peace and Planet Network, to name a few things he's involved in. He is an author with books including Empire and the Bomb, How the U.S. Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World, The Sun Never Sets, Confronting the Network of U.S. Foreign Military Bases, and The Deadly Connection, Nuclear War and U.S. Foreign Military Intervention. When I first met him, Joseph was director of programs for the American Friends Service Committee's New England office. And since then, he's been a really important source of trustworthy information, analysis, and organizing for me. I've learned so much from him and continue to, which is why I regularly welcome him back to come to our series and speak with us on one of the many topics that he is so well versed in. Tonight, we're going to hear from him, like I said, and then we'll move to the Q&A part of it. So let's start by welcoming, in a very visible way, Joseph, and thanking him for joining us. Welcome, Joseph. And remember to unmute. There, you got it. Oh.
Yeah, as I was talking to you before about technology, so just a wonderful, wonderful introduction, and it takes two to tango. So I just really appreciate the really great spirit and the many years you've put into just trying to help the world be a little bit better place. So just to appreciate that, back to you. So should I jump in here? Okay, everybody, pray for the technology. Okay. A second. Let's see how we're going to do this. Okay, we'll start here. Before doing this first slide here, just to say that U.S. China relations go back to the late 18th century. It's very short period of time after the formation of the U.S. state, and that came in the form of trading ships. So it's been a
Joseph,
long. Yes.
Do you know we can't see anything yet?
Oh, that's not good. Hold on.
Okay.
That's not good at all. So we've got screen. Am I got screen share on?
I don't think so.
Okay, here we go. Okay, on the subject of technology, we okay? Can you see it now?
There it is. Got it.
Okay, all right. Let me jump in here. So as I was saying, it's a very long history of U.S. Chinese relations that have been up and down. And then maybe just to put the current moment, in the context of the U.S. presidential elections, which will determine a whole lot. But to go back a little bit, the first quotation there, twice in the 20th century, tensions between rising and declining powers led to catastrophe. It's our responsibility to prevent that from happening again. This is Joe Nye who said that. Nye was basically number 3 in the Pentagon under Bill Clinton and one of the principal architects of U.S. Asia policy, really from about 1980 on. And I have this here. I'm going to root us in some pretty heavy stuff because that's where we live. The other is a quotation from Samuel Huntington. Huntington is the man who wrote the book about the Clash of Civilizations. And he says the West won the world not by superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather its superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do. And to understand that this is really at the heart of the current arms race, but it goes beyond weapons as well. We've been living now in the Biden era with the national security strategy. And the central element of it is to say that the post-Cold War era is over and competition is underway between the major powers to shape what comes next. So to understand, this is principally between the United States and China, if you read the state strategy itself, but also just to appreciate the current moment. Kamala Harris is a deputy national security advisor and likely to have a very senior role in her government if she's elected, was the coordinator of the group that developed the national security strategy. So I think we can assume that this is pretty close to Rebecca Linsner's worldview. Also, kind of rooting us in the world that we're in at the moment, as we're dealing with this competition between great powers, there are some very unhappy parallels to the period leading up to World War I. And these have been commented on by a number of national leaders, prime ministers of countries in Asia Pacific. Competition between rising and declining powers. And Russia is clearly a declining power, and that's adding to the mix here. We have complex alliance systems, and I'll go a little bit into that in a bit. We have, as people are aware, the very deep economic interdependence and competition with China, less so with other major economic powers. We have territorial disputes. I'll go into that a bit later, but that's always a cause for war, and it was part of what triggered World War I. We have arms races with new technologies. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And we've got wild card actors, among them Donald Trump, but many others. Then to appreciate that we're in a moment of, what do you call it, maybe a relative calm, a very fragile calm. As we were into beginning 2023, the tensions between the U.S. and China were building. Communication had been in many ways severed. And I think both sides got a bit frightened about where this was going to go. So you had some signaling from both sides that it was time to talk, to try to find ways to tamp down the increasingly spiraling tensions. And there was to been a meeting with Blinken going to China, but some of you will remember the balloon that crossed the United States and put that off. So we had to wait some months later. And then in November 2023, almost a year ago now, we had this summit. It took place actually in California on the side of a meeting of the Asia Pacific Economic Coordination. So things are in a quieter period than they have been, but all the structural problems are there, and we continue to have some very dangerous clashes. I'll come back to the Philippines in a minute. And then to understand, I tend to look at things in historical terms to understand historical forces that are creating the reality that we're in and pushing it. So on the one hand, to appreciate that, we are a 250-year-old colonial settler state. Amy reminded us of the ground that many of us are standing on. And that came with a kind of a manifest destiny approach to conquering a continent and then creating a global empire. Uh, some years ago, about a decade ago, I was in China and was with a fairly senior diplomat, not the top of the not top rung, but I asked him, "What does it mean to be Chinese?" And he said to me, "Well, it means being an expression of 5,000 years of history." So to understand that, uh, Chinese understand themselves as part of a very deep and long history and culture, and one which was for much of recorded history, the most advanced and powerful country in the world. And then to look at the period, the competition we've got now, it takes place on many levels. I know Arnie has heard this from me before, but when I was a freshman at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, we had a professor who the only way you could pass one of his tests in comparative civilization was to analyze a society at six interrelated levels: economic, military, social, intellectual, spiritual, and cultural. And as he said, in different periods of history, one dimension may be more dominant than the other, but they're interdependent. So at the moment, we have competition between the United States and China, and to a lesser extent with Russia, in both conventional and nuclear military dimensions. We have profound economic competition, both to advance the economies of the native society, if you will, but also the global competition, and then education and technology. And to recognize, put the thing on the side here about Star Wars having arrived. There's an article, I think, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, which is talking about the current state of the revolution of military affairs, and the power of drone swarms. So, it's possible to knock down a drone, and it's possible to knock down a bunch of drones, but try knocking down 200 drones, all coming for the same aircraft carrier, for the same jet fighter, and we're moving very much into this high technology, which shows you. I mean, the real cutting edge in the military competition is the technological competition. So, from the Chinese perspective, um, they're coming out of, and the government there will remind its people in the world over and over again, that they're coming out of 150 years of humiliation. This is the proud Chinese civilization of so many centuries, right? And if you look at the history, what you see is in the late 18th century and the first part of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was in decline. I mean, dynasties do that. Look at the British, and so you had that internal decline, and then you had the Opium Wars, the 1840s and the 1860s, and this was a problem because the English liked their tea too much. They had a what do you call it? They were running out of silver to pay for all the tea they were importing, and so they figured the way around it was to take opium from their colonies in India and sell it to the Chinese, get the money back, and of course make a lot of people addicted. It wasn't only the British who got in on this. Some of the wealthiest families in the United States, the Forbes, the Vanderbilts, they couldn't get the Indian tea, but Indian opium, but they got it from Turkey. And so, for example, John Kerry is a descendant of drug traders of the Forbes family. So we have that, and it's well remembered, and lessons taken from it by the Chinese. So, needless to say, China has risen. It's amazing. I mean, I first went to China in 1999, and I came back a decade later. It was an entirely different country. If you go to Shanghai, it makes New York City look small, like a country village. So, enormous growth in their cities. And then on the right, there's the China Belt and Road, which people have heard about. I want to call people's attention to that orange line that goes from Scandinavia to Shanghai. Again, probably about 25 years ago, I was at a conference, and there was a Swedish diplomat who did a presentation, and basically he had a map of Eurasia in which he showed then a railroad connecting Scandinavia with China. So this is what the future looks like. And across those rail lines will come trade and ideas, and it will unify, in many ways, it will unify Eurasia. And he asked, well, what's missing from this picture? Well, obviously, what's missing from this picture is the United States. And it's worth remembering here as well that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and the founder of the Trilateral Commission, he, going back to older geopolitical analysis, would argue that whoever controls the heartland of Eurasia is the world's dominant power. And so what you see with this map, especially the orange line, is the potential for Eurasian unity. And it's interesting to know that the EU now is looking at increasing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles because they're afraid they're just going to be totally overwhelmed. So it's an interesting dynamic there. And again, much of the U.S. discourse around the Belt and Road has been around this being a form of Chinese imperialism, which maybe to a degree it is, just as the U.S. ships and military have followed U.S. trade around the world. The driving force of it has been overproduction in a number of Chinese provinces. They need markets, and so they're pushing out. And it's again worth knowing, just in terms of some of the parallels of development. It was in the 1870s that after 40 acres and a mule, we had overproduction of corn and wheat in this country, and farmers demanding foreign markets, which was a driving force both for deepening U.S. control in Latin America and then in the 1890s for Europe as well. Okay, then the social contract. The picture on the left is maybe just a scad out of date, but the social contract in China has been essentially that it will raise everybody's standard of living. You'll have a better life than you had, but you don't challenge the Leninist Communist Party and its system. Some of the economic crises that China has been facing on the other side of COVID are maybe putting that a little bit in jeopardy and forcing some changes and certainly some nervousness in Beijing. On the right is my hero, Fan Lizhi. He wrote a book which I think is called The Most Dangerous Man in China, something like that. He was a physicist. He was long a loyal communist. But he was dealing with a contradiction because the Communist Party said whatever it said was truth and had to be followed. But as he followed science, he found that it wasn't always true. And he had to confront that. And that was the driving force behind the democracy movement of the 1980s in China that culminated in Tiananmen Square. He managed to get out, but boy, it was hard. And he ended up actually in exile in Arizona at Kitts Peak, where he wrote something like 300, he either authored or co-authored something like 300 scientific papers. And I would commend his book to everybody. There's some beautiful, amazing things in it. And going again here structurally, as we look at the current and into the future. First of all, let's just look at population differences. So as you can see, China's population compared to the United States is huge, almost, it's more than double. And so what you have is more people who can study to be engineers, more people who can start businesses, more. And if it is handled well, it becomes an extremely powerful situation. And on the right, you see maybe a couple years old the global GDP and percentages. So the United States is still higher, but one of the things that's interesting in relationship to what you see with the red sector there with China, you also have Japan and India in there as well, and this also illustrates that the economic dynamism and power of the Asia Pacific is really what's been fueling the world economy, and U.S. leaders want their fair share of it or to contain it. Then, yeah, so to alliances. Um, you know, this will be controversial for some people, but I think it's true. The Pacific theater of the Second World War was very different from that in Europe. In the Pacific, it was a competition between three empires, between the British Empire, the American Empire, and the Japanese Empire. The Japanese had only 1/10 of the domestic product of the United States. Their leaders even understood that they could not prevail before they launched it. And in the aftermath, the Pacific was referred to as an American lake, and the U.S. dictated a number of treaties. Actually, formed the Japanese government under MacArthur. So secretly, in 1951 and 52, the United States imposed the Mutual Security Treaty as the term and condition for ending the military occupation. And in some ways, less formally, the military occupation continues. Similarly, with the United States and South Korea, Philippines was an American colony from 1898, and again, after the war, we put in a new mutual defense treaty, and more recently, we have the well, this is old too, the U.S. Australia New Zealand treaty. So you've got this long history of U.S. military power reinforcing the U.S. dominance and hegemony in the Pacific and much of Asia. But under Biden and Kurt Campbell, who's now the number two in the National Security Council, kind of recognizing the relative decline of U.S. power, not decline of power, but relative decline of power in relationship to China. The United States has been putting together a series of interrelated alliances referred to as a lattice-like network. So you have a U.S.-Japan Republic of Korea, South Korea alliance, which is difficult to put together and maintain because of Korean continued anger over what the Japanese did when they colonized, brutal colonization of Korea. We have the Quad, which is the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. It's less a military alliance right now, but it's a network, and it operates in many ways together to kind of reinforce the power and influence of its members. We have AUKUS from a few years ago, the U.S., Australia, and Britain. With that came nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, probably in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Global NATO. Why is NATO here? NATO is now a global alliance. At its summit in Washington this summer, present were the prime ministers of Japan, of Korea, of Australia, and the Philippines. And you have deepening military engagements and cooperation between NATO and U.S. allies. And then you have the U.S. Japan Philippines alliance, and that's getting a little bit hot at the moment in the Philippines. And then not formally with Taiwan, but functionally, you have a U.S. alliance with Taiwan and Japan doing much the same. Get to the next slide here. So this is what it looks like. You see China there at the center, and you see it surrounded by U.S. alliances, bases, and Seventh Fleet that wasn't supposed to be moving. Just to give you the vision there. Yeah. So we have there's a number of flashpoints. one of which is the South China Sea, portions of which are referred to by the Filipinos as the West Philippine Sea. And as you see with the map on the left, you've got these two red lines, and the first of what's called the first island chain, which runs basically including South Korea through Japan, Taiwan, down to the Philippines and over to Vietnam. And basically, the U.S. controls that line, which in turn threatens to isolate China. China is heavily dependent both on export trade, but also for fossil fuels that are brought in from the Middle East, much of it across the South China Sea. So this is a continuing threat to the Chinese, and it blocks their access if exercised fully to the Pacific. Then you see the second island chain. The Chinese want to break the first island chain line, and largely doing it diplomatically. But there are times when they'll send their troops, rather their ships or their planes, across it, creating crises. Then on the right is a map of the South China Sea itself, and much like the Monroe Doctrine here, the Chinese have laid claim to 80 to 90% of that sea and its islands. On the one hand, there's thought to be a lot of mineral resources on the seabed, but also we're thinking about relative control and containment, and the Philippines, former government of Philippines, took the six other countries have claims to at least some of the territory there under the Law of the Sea Convention. And interestingly, the United States has not ratified the Law of the Sea, even though we insisted it must be respected by China. And so this has led to some clashes, but the Filipinos took the challenge to the International Court of Arbitration, a UN court, which ruled absolutely in favor of the Philippines and said that Chinese claims here have no standing. But much like the Supreme Court, the question is how many troops, how much power with police does the International Court of Arbitration have? The answer is none. And the Chinese have said they're not going to respect that. So it's interesting to say the least. Looking at time here, I'll try to move it along. Within that area, on the one hand, you've got the U.S. bases there, but within the South China Sea, especially near the Philippines and Vietnam, you have the Parcel Islands, you have the Spratly Islands, and you've got what were in some cases little shoals, sandbars. But the Chinese have transformed some of these into military bases as they project their power out. And the Chinese have what's now called the String of Pearls. These are not quite the same as the military bases and alliances that the United States has, but it has basing agreements ostensibly for trade. But there are many in the United States who see this as a possible infrastructure for projection of Chinese military power. And you see it kind of goes around India, which is a source of concern for leadership in India. I got to move along here. Yeah, so just to say that, Japan, we have the illusion that Japan is a state without a military. Couldn't be further from the truth. They're at the moment about the 10th biggest military budget in the world, and they're doubling their military budget. And they have been expanding their influence within the U.S. Set of alliances. But there's also some hesitance. What happens if Trump comes to power and on a whim he pulls back from some of those alliances? So the Japanese have been developing a series of separate bilateral agreements with a number of the regional powers. We come to Taiwan and nuclear threats. So I won't go into it in great depth here, but just to say that beginning in the 1950s, there was the competition for control between China. China views Taiwan as a renegade province, and it's been protected, first taken by the Japanese in 1895, and then by the U.S. in 45, then the U.S. protectorate. But on these occasions, including including what 19, this is there's more history to this, but a number of threats. We'll come back to them in a minute, maybe. The most recent confrontation that brought us close to a nuclear war was the 1996 Taiwan crisis, which I think I'll make reference to it here in a minute. There's also a Japanese-Chinese confrontation over these uninhabited islands. At the end of the Second World War, the U.S. gave administrative control to Japan, but left the question of who was sovereign there up in the air. And for the last 20 years or more, and again, we can go into the details of why, there's been increased military and maritime confrontations, including crashes between Japanese and Chinese ships. Quickly, I'm sorry. Yeah, this just underlines here the depth of the economic integration between the United States and China. The one big differential here, because in many ways it's similar. Well, the U.S. doesn't begin to export to China as much as the Chinese export to the United States, and that's obviously a source of tension. The other interesting one here is at the bottom. Only about 13,000 U.S. students in China, whereas the Chinese have about 330 students here in the United States. Among other things, that impacts the degree to which people in this country can understand what's going on in China, or the Chinese understand what's happening here. And then this is a lot to go over in just a second or three, but simply to say that a number of people have been looking at a range of common security policy alternatives. The concept of common security was basically the paradigm around which the Cold War was ended in 1987, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the basic truth in it is that a country or even individuals can't get security in competition in confrontation with their rivals, but only in dealing in looking at the mutual threats and exploring how you can get a win-win situation out of it. That's how we ended the arms race with the INF Treaty in 1987. So I'm actually working now with a group of scholars and movement leaders across Asia Pacific on a comprehensive common security report, which goes into this much more deeply. And it will be released actually on October the 8th. We'll post it, and we'll be having a major international launch webinar to push it out. But just to say, to reinforce the current U.S. China detente, there was a slide here which I somehow missed. But to understand that the around Taiwan, there's a lot of ambiguity. On the one hand, there's the competition around what is history, but after isolating China for a very long time, in 1971, Nixon went to China. Out of that came what was called the Shanghai Communique, in which the United States committed to a one China policy, and in that it said that we accept a one China policy with Chinese people on each side. That we acknowledge that, but the Chinese said that basically everybody accepts this, that it's one China, and with this difference from the beginning, it was the term that the Chinese were willing to compromise, muddying of the water that the Chinese were willing to accept in order to open the relations with the United States, both to triangulate against the Soviet Union at the time and to open trade, which was essential for their reform and opening. So I'm going to close there because I know we have to save time for questions. I've gone over a lot quickly. One of my frustrations is not to go deeper in some things, but that's what we've got. And take it away, Amy.
All right. So I'm gonna see. I don't really think we have questions yet. Remember, folks, that you can put questions into the chat. I think what I'll start with is asking you to actually spend a little more time on this, the common security policy alternatives. I guess part of what I'm thinking, as I'm listening to this history, and it kind of seems, I don't know, like, oh, what a mess. We're stuck in this way of being, but I'd like to hear a little more about the alternatives that you do see that people are talking about that could realistically help us out of these huge.
So I think the first is a need, and one of the problems we have is, again, it goes back in history. Chiang Kai-shek, who was the dictator, the military warlord in China, who fought the communists through the 1920s and 30s, and then lost to them in the 40s, and then took a couple million of his people and forces to Taiwan. He had enormous influence in Washington, in part through anti-communism, in part through actually religious ties, and money, of course, and developed a very strong congressional right-wing anti-Chinese lobby. And that continues to a degree to this day. One of the we now have, I mean, Trump ratcheted up, right? You have economic competition, but he really ratcheted up with hate and racism, and you now have actually a congressional committee made up of extreme hardline Republicans and unfortunately some Democrats as well, who view China as if you will, almost the Antichrist, and are driving U.S. confrontational policy with them. The reality is that China is not going to go away. And as we have, and some of these people are calling for regime change in China. Well, that only hardens nationalism within China. So most important, I think, is we need to recognize our systems are different. We may not love what the Chinese system is. We may oppose its human rights repression, but in doing so, we have to remember that we have 2 million people in prison here, and we're in the middle of a counter-revolution, which Trump is leading. So I think we have to recognize that these two major powers are going to exist for a while, unless we come to a shooting war. And if we come to a shooting war, the probability is that it goes nuclear, and then we can basically kiss goodbye to everything. So at root, we need to come to some respect. Ironically, although we have very different interpretations, the Chinese state has actually been stating that it supports common security. But we've got I have a friend who's there right now saying, the difference is in interpretation, but it's a dialogue that needs to take place. What are some possibilities? For one thing, there is the possibility that even with conventional weapons, the U.S. has such advanced arsenal that it could conceivably wipe out China's nuclear arsenal. This in turn is driving China to build more nuclear weapons, so they have a deterrent force. What the Chinese will say is that, again, looking at the history, because there were U.S. nuclear threats in 1954, in 1958, and China and Russia almost came to a nuclear exchange in 1969. And their biggest fear is the first strike. And when you're talking to some of their senior analysts or physicists, they say the United States needs to move to abandon its first strike nuclear doctrine. And at least we need to begin some negotiations in that direction. That's key. On the one China policy, which is again very central, the United States has been chipping away at that quite deeply. Um, uh, when Biden came to his inauguration, uh, he invited the pseudo ambassador of Taiwan, who's in Washington, to come to the inauguration. This had not been done for decades, so it was a signal. Language on the State Department webpage backed off of commitment to one China policy. And then you had the visits to Taiwan. The worst was Nancy Pelosi, right? Which the Taiwanese didn't even really want. And that led, in response, the Chinese did a simulated blockade of Taiwan to show their potential. So we need to more deeply embrace it, the one China policy. And I think one of the challenges for all of us is to develop a new paradigm which can allow for the continuation of democracy in Taiwan, while also reaffirming a kind of the Chinese historic claims and negotiations. That's hard. Before the Chinese basically imposed their national security law in Hong Kong and moved to repress democracy there in a very firm way. The idea of one state, one country, two systems was still being discussed in Taiwan, but not now. It's just not trusted. The other, which you could signal as a way to at least build down some of the tensions, the United States engages in massive military exercises, often with its partners, designed basically to intimidate both China and North Korea. Being a political realist, I don't expect them to end, but you can do diplomatic signaling by dialing down those military exercises. We've just with the deal since November 23, there has been more dialogue between U.S. and Chinese leaders. That needs to be reinforced. And Winston Churchill was never my great hero, far from it. But he was really very, very strong. It's much better to jaw than to war. And I think that's got to be an approach. And to respect, also, I think it's important for us to respect, even as there's really quite serious human rights repression in China, to recognize that there are Chinese people and there's the Chinese state, and building more people-to-people contacts can only be helpful.
Okay, thanks. We have some questions now. Is it okay if I turn off your screen share now, Joseph?
Oh, sure, please.
Still using it? Okay. I've got one from Arnie and Judy here first up. Among elite foreign policy intellectuals, the blob, is there bipartisan consensus on U.S. China relations? Are there elite policy makers, including influential members of Congress, who advocate for de-escalation?
There are some who advocate for de-escalation, but a combination of just the political forces that have been built. So the question is, if you're an elite political figure, well, the difference between, I guess, intellectuals and political figures, but certainly the commitment, on almost a bipartisan commitment, is to maintain U.S. hegemony. And to maintain U.S. hegemony, that means military buildups, that means confrontations, that means pushing back any challenges that the other side may raise. Intellectually, you do have some challenges. I mean, to the blob, if you will. One which I've been privileged to be a part of has been the Committee for a Sane U.S. China Policy. It's our steering committee has been a number of uh, security analysts. And actually, the other place to look at would be the Quincy Institute in Washington. They have Michael Swain is there, and come up with his name, Jake Werner. So you can go to the Quincy Institute, and you'll find a lot of really good analysis there. But it's uphill.
Okay, I'm gonna jump around a little. We have someone joining us, I think, from the Philippines, who says, here in the Philippines, in the face of Chinese provocative actions against the Philippine Coast Guard and
Mhm,
fisher folks,
mhm.
there are forces clamoring that the government invoke the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty. What do you think would happen if the Philippine government does this?
Uh, that brings us very close to a U.S. China war. And uh, it's interesting. I mean, we've had a series of confrontations on different shoals, and when it got particularly nasty on one shoal, there was an agreement that the Chinese would back off, but then they put pressure on another shoal. So it's going to take a lot of diplomacy. The United States has just committed to send the Philippines another $500 million worth of military support. Um, so I think what it argues for is redoubling diplomacy. I'd call actually in the report that I made reference to that will be issuing in October. There's a a chapter written by Walden Bellow. Walden has been, I mean, he was a leading opponent of Marcos, a leading opponent of the U.S. military bases. He had to go into exile at one point. And he also has been deeply involved in challenging the Chinese control of what he and a number of others refer to as the West Philippine Sea. What he argues for, and I think it's worth looking at, is following more of the Vietnamese model because they're also suffering from incursions from China in terms of pursuing more engaged diplomacy. So I think this is what we have to do. If the U.S. Philippine Article 5 of the U.S. Philippine um, alliance is cited, then the question will be: is the United States willing to go to war with China? And there's not going to be a lot of popular support for that here. But on the other hand, in that case, the whole alliance structure that the United States has created comes into question. If we don't follow through on our alliance commitments, then U.S. hegemony falls apart. So it's people should understand just how serious this situation is.
Yeah, okay. I think David's question was answered. Let's see what we got. Oh, here's a question from Thomas. Are there any peace groups in China taking part in discussions with Western peace groups, such as the International Peace Bureau? Are they members of it? Yeah.
So here's what I can tell you. It kind of brings a smile to my face. At one level, no. I mean, the Chinese government has basically uh, put down uh, any challenges to its authority. But what you do have are um, intellectuals, think tanks, people associated with the Communist Party who are exploring possibilities. So just in the last couple of days, there's been a international symposium held in Shanghai about uh, diplomacy in an era of increasing multipolarity. And one of the participants in that discussion was Rainer Braun, who was the former uh, uh, director of the International Peace Bureau, and before that had been its co-president. And I had a conversation with him actually 2 days ago when he was still in Shanghai. And what he said was, he was commenting that there's a lot of discussion about common security in the circles of those think tanks, uh, although the interpretation of what it means is a bit different, right? But he was also saying that they have committed to comment on our common security um, report, and also to share it with similar think tanks in other major Chinese cities. So room for at least some discussion and dialogue to see where it leads. I mean, I don't think we should have illusions about what the Chinese state is, but then again, we shouldn't have illusions about what the American state is.
Right. Yeah, good point. I think we have time for at least one, maybe two. Let's see how it goes. But Doug would like you to say a bit more about the Chinese nuclear first strike position and capabilities versus the U.S. and how that is affecting the international dynamic, particularly since you mentioned this as maybe something that we can, something we might be able to influence as peace activists.
Right. So China does not have a first strike policy. Their policy has been to have a deterrent force. Until recently, they had about 200 to 300 nuclear warheads, and the thought from their side was this was sufficient to threaten the total destruction of the other side if the other side attacked first. But with the uh, development of missile defenses that the United States now has deployed uh, around much of China, plus capabilities of our submarines. From the Chinese perspective, the thought was that their deterrent force was in jeopardy. And so this has led to a buildup. What we're also hearing, and it seems, again, I can't be definitive on this, but they're now up to about 500 nuclear weapons. We've got 1,500 deployed and then more in stockpiles. Uh, uh, it's reported that the Chinese approach is to do a buildup on a kind of step-by-step basis. On the one hand, they may seek parity with the United States and Russia, the 1,550 level. Or if the U.S. will move to remove or engage in diplomacy leading to removal of the first strike doctrine, then they would halt their buildup. The other piece that's here, and I don't want to scare people too much, but we have to think in terms of what's real out there. In the era of the digital era here, AI and cyber technologies, one of the fears increasingly on all sides is the ability to penetrate the other side's command and control system digitally, and to use that then to disarm the other side, so they don't have a deterrent capability. So again, there was for a period, it's not going on now, but there was a dialogue between a number of very senior physicists here in the United States, and analysts and Chinese as well, where this was identified as a key area where we need to have negotiations and come to agreements, so that we don't have penetration, or countries fear of penetration. So if you're fearing penetration, that increases your inclination to launch a first strike, use them or lose them. So building trust is absolutely essential. And trust is it's pretty weak in relationship to U.S. China. It's absolutely shattered in relationship to U.S. and Russia right now.
Yeah, thank you. So there are quite a few more questions, but I want to mention that Joseph has agreed to stay a little later after our official close time to answer a few more. So don't worry if you haven't had yours answered. If you can stick around, we can do a few more. But I think I'm going to do our official closing for the moment. And first, I want to make sure everyone knows how to find, let's see. let's see, trying to do the cut and paste into the chat. Oh, there it is. Joseph's work and how to keep up with that. And I'll say aloud, the cpdcs.org website is his. Also, actually, I'll pop in his page at Common Dreams, where a lot of his articles that are really fascinating and useful appear. And then let me tell you, we would love for you to stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action, nhpeaceaction.org, and on Facebook. You can learn more about what we're doing, working on, what programming we have coming up, etc. There's something in chat for that. And here's a few things we have coming up. If you're local, please join us for a Ceasefire Now vigil. The upcoming schedule is Wednesday, September 11, 2 to 3 p.m. vigil at Rep. Pappas's office in Dover. Then Thursday, September 12th, noon to 1 p.m. is the City Plaza Concord vigil. Wednesday, September 18th, 2 to 3, we swap in Dover, and we're in front of Senator Shaheen's office on Central Ave. Back to online. First, our annual online auction is live now until September 21. We have books, jewelry, artwork, household items, lift tickets, gift cards, etc. Wonderful things. Please check it out. You can get some good, fun stuff and support us. Again, I'm going to try.
Let me jump in with one more announcement, which is that we'll send out, I give it to everybody here, on October the 9th, CPDCS will be doing a webinar with Reiner Braun on the lessons from his time in Shanghai. So for deeper and very current analysis.
Excellent. Thank you. I don't know, Dorian, if you can get the auction in there, my thing isn't working.
I just popped it in the chat.
Okay, thank you. So a few more things. On this Thursday, September 12th, 7 p.m., New Hampshire Peace Action and 350 New Hampshire are holding a direct candidate engagement bird dog training on Zoom, led by Elizabeth Bielowski. Please come so that you're ready for when all these candidates continue to pour in. Our next online peace and justice conversation will be Monday, September 23, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Standing in solidarity and dismantling hate. We have Xandra Rice Hawkins of Granite State Progress and Bill Maddox of No Hate New Hampshire and the New Hampshire Peacekeeper Project. And they'll talk about the principles of nonviolent action and how we can all work to detect and dismantle political violence. Then let's see, I want to call your attention to our Sunday, October 13th annual fall event. It will be 11:30 to 3 p.m. this year, called Pathways to Peace, Learning from Palestinians and Israelis and Each Other. It will both be at the Dairyfield restaurant in Manchester, but there is also a Zoom option for the program portion, when we'll be excited to welcome from Palestine and Israel via Zoom, members of Combatants for Peace, a group of ex-combatant Israelis and Palestinians who laid down their weapons and rejected all means of violence. We are very excited about this event and really hope you can attend in person or on Zoom. The series here is free, but open to everyone. It will stay that way. However, it is really helpful when you do contribute. And our nhpeaceaction.org/donate link will bring you there.